unholy. Let us die to make men free. While God is marching on. Oh, glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The highest praise is glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
As the first Great Migration continued during the early 1900s, many African Americans struggled to establish and maintain their new lives in northern cities. These pioneers advanced through great hardship, many into uncharted territory, to make a better existence for themselves and their families. One such story details the settlement of a suburb of Detroit called Inkster, Michigan.
This was unique because blacks began to live in this suburb about 1919. They started moving in. It was one of the few areas outside of Detroit that was not under racial restrictions or racial covenants. The Detroit head of the Urban League, John Dancy, who was black, enlisted the aid of a white man named Packard to go as kind of like run interference to make the initial deal for the land. So what happened was around during the 1920s, a group of several hundred blacks moved from Detroit's east side, black ghetto, to this little town, Inkster. At the time it was virtually a field, and they started putting up homes practically overnight. They were a little more than shacks. But they wanted, it showed several things. They wanted to get out of Detroit, the squalor of Detroit. They were probably worse off in Inkster than they were in Detroit. They had no running water in many cases. There was no garbage collection. There were no streets sometimes. But what it illustrated was that these folks were willing to put their immediate goals in second place. They wanted to start a home. They had jobs. So what they figured was, we will start at the bottom. We'll build these shacks. As we work and get more money, we will add on to it. And over time, we will have a nice house. The idea that blacks cannot postpone their gratification, or that the working class people can't postpone their gratification, which is a myth, I think was proven a myth by what these people did. These were Southern sharecroppers, or Southerners, who had moved up to Detroit at the promise of Henry Ford. They would have a job, and they did. So for about 10 years during the 1920s, you got this influx of about 2,000 blacks that lived in this one little area of this unincorporated village. What is unique also is that when the village was incorporated, I think in 1826, there was a black man elected to the first city council. Now, the idea of a municipality getting started and have blacks not only present, but on the governing council was almost unheard of. The first police force, which was volunteer, had a black policeman on it. So at the very beginning, blacks were part of this municipality. They were 25% of the population. And that's considered unusual. It would take a long time since the founding of Detroit, for blacks to work themselves into positions of power in the city of Detroit, but in Inkster they started out that way. The 1930s proved to be a disaster, the Depression. If you look at the statistics of every northern city, their population, you'll see the black population rise from about World War I up to 1930. And in 1930 it almost just flattens out. There's no more jobs up north. In the 1940s it starts to shoot up again. The 1930s, you've heard that old saying, when things are always worse for blacks, last hired, first fired. Things got so bad for blacks in Detroit and in Inkster that you'd almost think they'd gone back to the Stone Age. People lost jobs, obviously. The things were bad for whites, but they were often, almost always worse for blacks because some of the whites took the jobs the blacks had. So you had a situation where the village was, the people lost their jobs, they couldn't pay their taxes. No taxes, that meant no revenue coming into the city. They had to lay off all the policemen. There was no fire protection, no garbage collection. Things got so bad, the village government started borrowing from private citizens to pay the bills. When that didn't work, the Detroit Edison Company cut off the municipal lighting in the city. There was no street lights. People who had bought things on credit, many of them black, had their possessions repossessed. Many of the people that had begun to build houses, which were substandard, but they were working on improving them on a week-by-week basis. Now, with no jobs, their houses became almost uninhabitable. One day in 1931, Henry Ford was passing through the village. Now, let me just give you an idea also. Inkster is about 6 miles from Detroit, from downtown, to about 17 miles from downtown Detroit. It's on Michigan Avenue, which is over US 12. That's Michigan Avenue is the main east-west street. Inkster Road is the main north-south street. So the city is divided into quadrants. Blacks were living in the south-west quadrant, almost exclusively. So Henry Ford came through the village. He saw how many of the blacks were living. He went back to his plant at Dearborn, the River Rouge plant in the city of Dearborn, and it essentially took over the village. He paid off all the debts. He got the lights turned back on. He provided water to the city. He paved roads. He set up a commissary. It was almost a welfare program that he set up. He had every able-bodied man to work. In return, he fixed up their houses. If they didn't have a place to live, he built, I think, 150 new homes at cost. And by cost, I mean $1,400, which even then was cheap, for a new house. But he would supply the labor from the Rouge plant, and the men in the village would be hired to build the houses. They were hired to grow crops, pave streets, or they were given jobs at the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn. In return, they would be paid $5 a day, of which $4 would be kept by Ford to pay their expenses. Ford sent a nurse to the village every week and a doctor. If they needed dental care, he sent a dentist. If they needed hospital care, he would have them go to the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. He provided them with food. He would heat their homes with coal from the River Rouge plant, provide them with jobs, free medical care. At the time, the black students in the village were going to high school in Dearborn, which did not have a good reputation in terms of how they related to African Americans. They didn't like blacks in Dearborn. And to some extent, that's not that far from the situation today. So the black students in Dearborn were having a hard time. Henry Ford built an elementary school. He built a high school in Inkster. He supplied the supplies, paid the janitorial costs. When the students graduated the first couple of years, he provided the buses to take them on a senior class trip. He almost lavished them with care. In return, he got probably the most loyal workforce the auto industry had ever seen. Henry Ford employed at one time more blacks than all the other auto companies combined in Detroit, about 9,000. And about 8,000 worked at one plant, the Ford Rouge plant in Dearborn. And what it did was to save approximately 2,300 blacks who lived in Inkster from the throes of the Depression, because it was bad, and essentially if it hadn't been for Henry Ford, there would have been no way out. These people were just desperate. Why Ford did this is still open to speculation. My study says that it was his money, his property. He could do with it as he wished. And I think what he was doing is trying some social engineering, which was kind of reminiscent of the big industrials coming out of the Progressive era. Here in Chicago, Pullman did the same thing with his community on the South Side. He tried to make it into his image. What Henry Ford would do is when people got aid, he would send workers from his Rouge plant out to check on them. You had to have money in the bank. Your wife could not work in most cases. You had to be clean. You had to have a clean house. He would ask your neighbors, do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you abuse your wife? Do you go out to bars? And if you passed all of those requirements, then you got the money. In return, you were expected to work. He deducted money from your salary, but essentially you got everything that you needed. And what it did, what it seems to me was, it was like a bridge. When World War II started, the Depression ended, so times were flush. Inkster was in a good position. The black folks in Inkster were in a good position. Not only did they have jobs, now there were more jobs going around because of the defense industry. So what some of the residents did, some of the black residents, what I might say also beforehand, before Ford stepped in as the village was being helped, the white residents attempted to vacate incorporation of the village. They wanted to split it. At the time, all the blacks were living below Michigan Avenue, and the whites were living above Michigan Avenue. If they had split the village, the black part of town would have been left with most of the debt, and the white part of town would have formed another village or either incorporated into some of the other surrounding cities. It was the black residents mainly that fought against dissolving the village. They essentially kept Inkster together. When World War II came, what the African Americans did was use not only Henry Ford, but institutional racism to actually help their position. One reason was because most of the defense workers were living in Detroit, obviously speaking. And Detroit was becoming overcrowded by the 1940s. Detroit had not had a major racial incident because the city's population grew, but also the area grew. And Detroit's a city of single-family homes and not apartment buildings like we have in Chicago. So, except for the Ossian Suite case, I think in 1923 or 24, Detroit didn't have a riot like Chicago did or some of the other urban cities. But in the 1940s, it was different. 150,000 blacks entered Detroit between 1940 and 1950. That doubled the black population in 10 years. There were about 6,000 blacks in Detroit at the turn of the century, 1900. It reached 120,000 by about 1930, and then 150,000 between 1940 and 1950. So all of a sudden Detroit reached its limits, and all of a sudden all these blacks are coming in. That's when you had the race riot in Detroit. It was over housing, because there just wasn't enough housing going around. The government had built a housing project for blacks in the northeast part of town, so German troop homes, but it was in a white neighborhood. When the whites found out that they were going to move blacks into this housing project, they went crazy. And the government, to some extent, had to back off, and that, of course, angered blacks. What the residents of Inkster did was, during the war, Henry Ford had been contracted to build an airplane factory to produce bombers. The government thought he would build it at the Rouge plant, which is in Dearborn. Instead, he built it in Ypsilanti, which is about 40 miles from downtown Detroit in Washtenaw County. The workers were coming from Detroit going out to Ypsilanti. That was almost 40 miles one way. During the 40s, which meant there was gas rationing going on. And the fact that you had to work, you had to travel that distance meant that there was a lot of absenteeism. People couldn't get to work, they couldn't get back home. It was a real problem. So the residents of Inkster by that time, a lot of the housing was still substandard. So what they did was go to the federal government and say, look, you need housing for workers. And a lot of the people from Inkster were working in Ypsilanti. And they said, now, none of the other cities want government housing, especially if it means blacks moving in. We in the southern part of Inkster would welcome government housing. And so the government built several housing projects in Inkster to house essentially the black workers, but the government did not build integrated housing at that time. The other point I want to make is, contrary to popular belief, government housing, which was usually one-story or two-story buildings, did not have the connotations that it has today. The residents that moved in were all black. They were all working. They were all in families. I interviewed one lady. Her name was Leanna Hicks, as a matter of fact. She lived in the government housing, and to show you how the situation has changed between then and now. When they first moved in, all the kids had keys, but they kept losing the keys. So after a while, she just threw up her hands and decided that she wouldn't give them any keys, so they kept the doors unlocked most of the time. And they didn't worry about theft, they didn't worry about crime. You tell somebody that today, that you're going to live in public housing, they're not going to lock the doors many times, and, they think that you're crazy. But this was the case, And so they cleared a lot of the substandard housing, but people moved in who were still working in the defense industry. After that, the population began to get so big that it was putting pressure on the high school. So the residents then argued that the government should build a new high school for Inkster, because they moved in all these people. And at that time, the government would have to support the housing with schools. So out of the arrangement, people in Inkster went to Washington, argued for a new high school, and got a new high school built by the government. So in one sense, had it not been for, which is unfortunate, the incident in Detroit with the riot around the Sojourner that happened because of the Sojourner Truth Homes, Inkster probably wouldn't have survived or wouldn't have prospered as it did. But what it told me was how these group of blacks in this small little suburb outside Detroit, independent of Detroit, were able to manipulate the system, were able to use the system. They used Henry Ford. Henry Ford in turn used them, but they got something out of it. And to me, it says a lot about the fact that these group of blacks took matters into their own hands. They were their own actors, and they participated in their own building of their community, because they built essentially a community there. Eventually, as segregation lessened, they were able to move other areas to other areas of the city. City is now, I think, predominantly black. They have elected at one time or another a black mayor. They've had blacks in the police force. They've had blacks in all areas of government since the beginning. I think there's only been 2 city councils that have not had blacks on the city council. And for, you think, a suburban area outside a big city, from the corporation on, that there's been this black presence. And, they've always had this ability to get, involved in their community, in the police department, the fire department, even in the housing commission. They stacked it at one time. It was one of the few places that they didn't get a lot of resistance. So at one time, the housing commission was all black in Inkster. So what they did was to, in the southern part of town, which was still predominantly black, had the houses built on double lots. So some of the best housing in the city is actually in the black part of town. Whereas in the northern part of the town, the houses are built on single lots and a lot smaller. In the southern part of town, some of the houses are built on double lots. They're obviously a lot more elaborate. And so in that respect, you have some of the poorest housing in the black section of town, but you also have the best housing in the black part of town. And I think it illustrates how black people, given their own, or even left to their own devices, have been able to figure out the system, maneuver the system long before there was a civil rights movement, long before there were classes in political science and whatnot. But they saw how to run the system, and they used it to their own advantage.
The residents of Inkster, Michigan moved to this suburb of Detroit to escape the ravages of what we now call Red Summer. Race riots throughout the country made it almost impossible for African Americans in major cities to provide safety for themselves and their families. For African Americans in Detroit, Chicago, and Houston, survival became the #1 priority.
This was a period when northern factories and factory owners like Henry Ford went to the South and literally started recruiting blacks and poor whites to come north to fill these labor needs. It was also a time, of course, when blacks began to be drafted into the Army, the armed forces. So what happened during the First World War, there was already this gap between Southern blacks and Northern blacks. Northern blacks were seen as, quote, crazy, unquote. You know, they didn't know how to say sir. They weren't used to segregation in the South. So there was some talk in the Army or the armed forces of having Northern blacks trained either in the North or, what is probably better, in their home state. The problem was it's not economical to have people trained in each state as opposed to bringing them all together in 1 or 2 bases. The problem was the Army bases were mostly in the South. So what happened at one incident in Houston, blacks had been sent down there to train. Obviously there was segregation. Blacks had some soldiers gone into the city for some recreation. They were insulted. I think some of them were shot at. They went back to the base, got their guns, went back into town, and a physical confrontation started, and shots were exchanged. It erupted into a full-blown riot. Blacks were shooting at whites, and whites were shooting at blacks. I think the outcome of that riot in Houston, which was one of the worst up to that point, was that I think there was something like 10 whites and maybe 2 or 3 blacks killed in the riot. Well, a number of black soldiers were court-martialed for it. Some of them were court-martialed and charged with murder. I think about a dozen black soldiers were actually hung as a result of that. And I think the unit that they were in was given a dishonorable discharge, and there were several dozen. That was reversed, I think, about 10 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, when the government decided that this was wrong and they had been treated unfairly, and they gave them an honorable discharge. But there were. That was a riot that took place in Houston, but it was a result of the war. The other riots that took place, like the ones in Detroit and Chicago, were as a result of blacks coming north and settling in areas that had been previously white, and in some cases getting jobs paid where they were getting the same amount of money as whites. And remember, there were a large number of Southern whites coming north also. So you mix Southern whites and Southern blacks in these factories, and that was like putting nitro and glycerin together. And so what you had in the South, rural South, was lynchings. In the urban North, it was urban race riots. And up until the 1960s, all these riots had a sameness to them. Blacks had moved into previously white neighborhoods. They were getting these good jobs, and they were working, sometimes getting the same amount of pay as whites, and a lot of Southern whites couldn't believe that or couldn't accept that. And as blacks tried to move out of their confined urban ghettos, they would come in contact with whites or move into an all-white neighborhood. And that usually was the spark that started the riots. Chicago, Detroit, New York. During the summer of 1919, which is called the Red Summer, there was something like 25 major urban race riots. The black soldiers were coming back. Some of them had served overseas. They were not willing to accept the old style segregation. They put their lives on the line. And so that sparked a number of urban race riots, and that would be the pattern up until the 60s. In almost all cases, though, the riots were started by whites. In the 60s, what happened, the riots were initiated by blacks. That was the first time in history that we had seen essentially a movement, I don't know if you could call it organized or not, where the riots were started by blacks. The end result, though, was the same. In almost all riots, most of the casualties are black, whether whites started or not. And usually the blacks are complaining about the same thing: police brutality, lack of housing, lack of facilities. Usually wasn't lack of jobs. That's what they always had in most cases. But it was housing, education, still discrimination, police brutality. And so if you look at that history in the North during the last century, you could just substitute the name, the city, and the causes, the outcomes, almost always going to be the same.
Sentence